Russian Army's barefoot marches, and mystical madness. The Russian Army's logistical failures reached levels that transformed basic military operations into survival ordeals. Russian soldiers marched hundreds of miles without boots, a reality that sounds impossible but happened regularly throughout the war. The Russian Army simply couldn't supply footwear to its massive forces, leaving entire regiments to trek across frozen ground barefoot. These marches weren't short distances either. Soldiers walked from training camps to front lines, covering 300 to 500 miles with nothing protecting their feet except strips of cloth when they could find them. Some men wrapped their feet in paper from letters home, while others used pieces of their uniforms as makeshift protection. The Russian supply system prioritized ammunition and food over basic clothing, meaning boots ranked as luxury items rather than essential equipment. Medical officers reported that some 1.8 million Russian troops suffered frostbite during the war, with infected foot wounds disabling more soldiers than enemy bullets during winter campaigns. Entire battalions arrived at battle positions with half their men unable to walk properly due to foot injuries sustained during these brutal marches. The collapse of traditional military order led Russian soldiers to embrace mysticism and superstition as coping mechanisms for unprecedented losses. Spiritualism rose dramatically as soldiers sought comfort from the constant death surrounding them, with entire units conducting seances to communicate with fallen comrades. Russian trenches became centers of supernatural activity, where soldiers claimed to receive messages from dead relatives guiding them through battles. Orthodox priests found themselves overwhelmed by requests for protective charms, blessed medallions, and religious ceremonies that promised divine protection from bullets and shells. Some Russian units refused to attack without elaborate blessing rituals that could last for hours, treating spiritual preparation as more important than tactical planning. Equipment shortages reached levels that turned Russian soldiers into scavengers during active combat. Officers regularly instructed their men to collect rifles from fallen comrades rather than expecting proper weapon supplies from military stores. This meant Russian soldiers entered battles knowing they might need to crawl across corpse-filled battlefields to find functioning firearms. Some men went into combat completely unarmed, waiting for casualties to provide them with weapons. The practice created a grotesque economy where Russian soldiers competed for rifles from their own dead teammates. Ammunition shortages compounded this problem, with soldiers limited to specific numbers of bullets regardless of combat duration. Some Russian units received 10 rounds per man for battles that lasted days, forcing extreme conservation of ammunition. Russian military experiments with specially distilled alcohol produced a substance called battle vodka that caused more problems than it solved. Military chemists created this enhanced alcohol believing it would eliminate fear and increase soldier aggression during combat. The battle vodka contained nearly twice the alcohol content of regular vodka, plus added stimulants that were supposed to boost courage and energy levels. Russian commanders distributed this substance before major attacks, expecting their men to charge enemy positions with chemically enhanced bravery. Instead, most soldiers became severely intoxicated and unable to follow basic commands or handle weapons safely. Some units became so drunk they fired on their own positions or wandered away from battlefields entirely. Medical officers reported numerous cases of alcohol poisoning from battle vodka consumption, with some soldiers requiring emergency treatment before seeing any combat. Orthodox priests conducted elaborate weapon blessing ceremonies that treated artillery shells like religious artifacts requiring divine intervention. These rituals involved priests sprinkling holy water on rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces while reciting prayers for divine protection and victory. The ceremonies for artillery shells were particularly elaborate, with priests performing full baptism rituals on explosive devices. Soldiers lined up with their weapons for individual blessings, creating long ceremonial processions that lasted hours. Some units spent entire days on weapon blessing ceremonies rather than training or preparing defensive positions. Russian soldiers believed blessed weapons would fire more accurately and cause greater damage to enemy forces. Russian commanders employed professional astrologers to determine optimal timing for military offensives, scheduling major attacks based on celestial events rather than strategic considerations. These astrologers analyzed star charts, planetary alignments, and lunar phases to identify supposedly favorable conditions for military operations. Russian attacks were delayed or accelerated depending on astrological predictions about cosmic influences on battlefield outcomes. This practice led to offensives launched during terrible weather conditions because astrologers claimed celestial alignments overrode environmental factors. Some Russian attacks began during blizzards or heavy rains simply because astrologers reported favorable star positions. The Russian supply system operated more like medieval foraging armies than modern military organizations, expecting soldiers to find their own food in war-torn territories. Russian troops received irregular supply deliveries and were instructed to supplement their rations by scavenging from abandoned farms and destroyed villages. This foraging system worked poorly in areas where previous armies had already stripped away available food sources. Russian soldiers competed with local civilian populations for whatever edible materials remained in devastated regions. Some units spent more time searching for food than fighting enemy forces, with soldiers dispersing across wide areas to hunt for sustenance. Russian winter uniforms demonstrated catastrophic planning failures that made soldiers more visible rather than providing camouflage protection. These white uniforms were designed to blend with snow-covered landscapes, but they turned bright yellow after a single washing due to poor quality materials and inadequate dyes. The yellowed uniforms stood out dramatically against white snow, making Russian soldiers perfect targets for enemy snipers and machine gunners. The Russian Medical Corps operated with staffing levels that guaranteed most wounded soldiers would die without receiving professional medical attention. Russian forces had only one trained surgeon for every 10,000 men, meaning that battlefield casualties faced overwhelming odds against survival. Most Russian soldiers injured during combat never saw a doctor, relying instead on basic first aid from fellow soldiers who lacked medical training. While the Russian army struggled with supply failures and mystical decision-making, their Austro-Hungarian allies faced an entirely different set of problems that would make Russian logistics look straightforward by comparison. Austro-Hungarian army's language chaos and ethnic paranoia. The Austro-Hungarian army faced a communication nightmare that sounds like a cruel joke played by geography and history. Individual military units contained soldiers speaking up to 11 different languages, including German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Croatian, Serbian, Romanian, Italian, Slovak, Slovene, and Ukrainian. Officers attempting to give basic commands like advance or retreat found themselves addressing men who literally could not understand what they were being told. A single company might include German-speaking Austrians, Hungarian cavalrymen, Czech infantry, and Polish artillery specialists, none of whom shared a common language for military communication. Company commanders often spoke only 2 or 3 languages themselves, leaving them unable to communicate with large portions of their own units. Simple orders that took seconds to deliver in other armies required complex translation chains that lasted minutes, if they worked at all. Military planners developed an elaborate system of hand signals and pictorial drawings to overcome language barriers, but these solutions created worse problems than the original communication issues. Officers drew pictures of tactical movements and battle plans, hoping soldiers would interpret sketches correctly during combat situations. Hand signals worked reasonably well during training exercises, but failed catastrophically when battle conditions included smoke, darkness, and artillery bombardments that made visual communication impossible. Some units developed their own unique gesture systems, meaning soldiers transferred between companies had to learn entirely new signal vocabularies. The pictorial order system led to disasters when soldiers misinterpreted drawings or when artistic abilities varied dramatically between commanding officers. Several documented battles failed because soldiers received contradictory visual orders or simply couldn't see hand signals through battlefield conditions. Ethnic paranoia infected the officer corps to such a degree that commanders regularly suspected their own soldiers of treason based purely on linguistic differences and regional accents. Officers from German and Hungarian backgrounds viewed Slavic soldiers with constant suspicion, believing that Czech, Serbian, or Polish troops would desert to enemy forces at the first opportunity. This suspicion extended to ridiculous extremes where soldiers speaking their native languages during off-duty hours faced accusations of plotting rebellion or communicating with enemy agents. Some commanders prohibited soldiers from speaking anything except German, even among themselves, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment that destroyed unit cohesion. Military intelligence officers spent more time spying on their own troops than gathering information about enemy positions, filing reports about suspicious conversations overheard in barracks rather than focusing on tactical intelligence. Mixed ethnicity firing squads executed soldiers for alleged disloyalty in scenes that epitomize the army's internal dysfunction. These execution details included German soldiers shooting Czech prisoners, Hungarian guards executing Serbian troops, and Polish riflemen killing Romanian deserters, often without any shared language for final communications. The condemned soldiers frequently had no idea what charges they faced because court-martial proceedings were conducted in languages they didn't understand. Some executions proceeded without translators present, meaning accused men died without comprehending their alleged crimes or having opportunities to defend themselves. Military records show numerous cases where soldiers were executed for desertion when they had simply become separated from their units due to language confusion during complex troop movements. Austro-Hungarian military engineers developed universal military symbols intended to transcend language barriers, but these pictographic systems proved more confusing than helpful. The symbol system included hundreds of different icons representing everything from troop movements to supply requests, requiring soldiers to memorize complex visual vocabularies that changed frequently as commanders added new symbols. Different units often used conflicting symbol systems, meaning reinforcements arriving from other sectors couldn't interpret local military communications. The symbols themselves were poorly designed, with similar-looking icons representing completely different concepts that led to catastrophic mix-ups during battle planning. Some symbols were so abstract that even officers who designed them forgot their meanings within weeks of implementation. Soldiers throughout the army developed the grim practice of writing wills in multiple languages because nobody knew which ethnic group would discover their bodies after battles. These multilingual testaments reflected soldiers' awareness that their final messages might need translation by Czech medics, Hungarian burial details, or German graves registration units. Some wills included up to 5 different language versions of the same message, with soldiers spending precious off-duty time ensuring their final wishes could be understood regardless of who found them. The practice also reflected deep uncertainty about unit composition, as soldiers couldn't predict which ethnic groups would survive battles to handle casualty processing and body identification. Military headquarters employed children as young as 12 years old as official translators for crucial battle communications, placing enormous responsibility on youngsters who barely understood military terminology in any language. These child translators handled orders between high-ranking officers and field commanders, meaning strategic decisions depended on pre-adolescent linguistic abilities. Some children worked 16-hour shifts translating complex tactical documents and urgent battlefield communications, while adults fought and died based on their interpretation accuracy. The practice created dangerous situations where military strategy depended on children's understanding of adult concepts like artillery coordinates, troop movements, and supply logistics. Several documented cases exist where translation errors by child interpreters led to friendly fire incidents or misdirected attacks. The uniform system created additional chaos by assigning completely different colors and styles to various ethnic units, making battlefield identification nearly impossible during combat conditions. German units wore standard gray uniforms while Hungarian troops dressed in distinctive bright colors that made them visible targets. Czech units received blue uniforms that resembled French military clothing, leading to confusion about unit identity during battles. Some ethnic regiments wore traditional regional clothing adapted for military use, creating a rainbow effect that destroyed any pretense of military uniformity or tactical camouflage. Soldiers often couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy forces when units from different ethnic backgrounds fought in the same areas. Religious services presented logistical nightmares as military chaplains attempted to provide spiritual support for Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim, and Jewish soldiers simultaneously. Base camps required multiple religious facilities and competing worship schedules that conflicted with military training and operational requirements. Catholic masses, Orthodox liturgies, Islamic prayers, and Jewish services all demanded different ceremonial supplies, dietary, accommodations, and burial practices that strained already overwhelmed supply systems. Some military units spent more resources on religious accommodation than on ammunition or medical supplies, with chaplains receiving priority transport space over essential military equipment. The combination of language barriers, ethnic tensions, and cultural conflicts produced the highest desertion rate of any major army during World War I. Entire companies abandoned their positions rather than continue fighting alongside soldiers they couldn't communicate with under officers they didn't trust. Some units dissolved completely when soldiers simply walked away from battles, returning to their home regions rather than continuing military service. Desertion reached such epidemic proportions that some sectors of the front lines became completely unmanned as Austro-Hungarian forces evaporated through mass abandonment. Military police spent more time hunting deserters than supporting combat operations, creating a vicious cycle where enforcement efforts further alienated remaining soldiers and encouraged additional desertion.